is it?
Real quick,
your praise is
was your prophet? When was the writings of your prophet written down? Who first wrote them down? Help us here. And who was the first to write it down? What is his name? Who wrote down the Siratul Rasulullah? His name is Ibn Hisham.
No.
His name is Al-Raqi.
Where did you get that from? Where did you get that from?
It's the earliest you have.
Wait.
You have nothing earlier than that. From your own scholars.
Where did you get that
From your own scholars.
Whoa, hold on a
Including
second.
Dr. Talat Kulich.
Are you
Dr. Ekman Nisalala. Come on. Can you show me anything earlier than Ibn Hisham?
Are you using a Muslim scholar who you do not trust to trust in what you are saying?
Oh, I don't have to. Here it is right here. Here is your Sirah.
You are a liar.
Who wrote the Sirah? I ask you again. Give me something earlier than Ibn Hisham. Can you give me something earlier than Ibn Hisham? Of course I'm not a liar. I'm using your own material against you. You can't answer, can you?
Are you a liar or a hypocrite?
Here we go, folks. Ibn Hisham.
The power is
Ibn Hisham is the earliest you know.
second generator for you.
Mansur, go ahead. Give me something earlier than Ibn Hisham.
I will give you
First of all, give us the name.
I will give you this.
Give us the name of the author of this book. No, I'm not going to give it to you. I'll never get it back if I do.
Are you a liar or a hypocrite?
That is yours. Here we go. Go ahead. From this one, show me the date it was written down. No, I'm not going to give it to you. Give it to me.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Mansur, give us the date for Ibn Hisham. Give us the date for Ibn Hisham.
Listen. I am going to answer your question from the very own book that you're using. Yes.
ladies and gentlemen,
No. We're not going to give you this book. Because you know what happens every time. You leave it, you run away with it, we don't get it back.
okay.
So give it to us now.
Wait.
Mansur.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a proposal. This is practically my life. Jay, I will exchange you this phone for
No,
that book.
I'm not exchanging. Read it in there and show me the date.
Okay? Jay, you're such a woman. Jay, I will give you my car keys.
We're not giving you anything. I want you to tell me the date this was written down. I want you to tell me the date the man died who wrote the first biography of your prophet.
I will.
Give me the date.
I will show you from there.
No, not from this one. You should find it in your own thoughts. Go ahead. Tell me the dates.
Why are you giving him water? It's going to be too much.
It's not honey now.
We have evidence now.
So I'm going to take what, 5 minutes, and then you go have 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes.
It's alright.
It's okay.
Come on, put the ladder. Get up on the ladder. Come on the ladder. Why are you scared to get on the ladder? Come on, Mansur, get on the ladder. Let's go. 5 minutes.
You did not give me the book. I wanted the ladder.
How do you trust him with a ladder?
You can have the ladder, but we're not giving you the book. I want you to get on the ladder. They all want to see him. Do you want to see him? Get on the ladder. Go ahead. She knows a lot more than almost all of you guys know. Thank God for our women! They can run circles around you, man! Go ahead.
Why is she speaking? The Bible says the woman has to keep quiet. Why is the woman speaking? Keep silent. This man does not tell us this. The book in his hands is the life of Muhammad.
Sirat Rasulullah of Ibn Ishaq, translated by Qilm. What he doesn't tell you is this. There is no such manuscript of Ibn Ishaq which this book is translated from.
Thank you.
Don't interrupt. I didn't even have my 5 minutes. That's around 30 seconds he's interrupting. Are you going to let me finish?
Look, when I talk, you're all going to interrupt. Just get used to it.
Did I interrupt you?
You're going to all interrupt when I talk. Wait and see.
You don't interrupt me.
Go ahead. You have 5 minutes. I'm timing you. Go ahead.
5 minutes starts now. So this translation by is based on what? Secondary sources mainly. Many sources. He lists them. Listen. Now you're interrupting. Your friend Bear is interrupting. Tell her to...
Oh, Mansur, stop being a little tweak. Keep going. If you've got a problem with interruption, listen to what I have to go through every week. Get used to it. Go on.
If you are really interested in this dialogue, tell your friends who are on the ladder 2 weeks past is with you. So she's with you, right? So ask her not to speak while we're speaking.
What is your problem? Get on with it.
My problem is...
The woman hurts you. I know she bothers you. Now get on with it.
No.
Hurry up. What are you trying to say?
Helen has actually listed the sources of his Ibn Ishaq. So it wasn't a particular manuscript of Ibn Ishaq that he's translated all of them. He's getting from Ibn Sa'd, Tabaqat Ibn Sa'd, he's getting from Tabari, he's getting from others. Waqidi maybe, Musa bin Uqba and various others. So now we realize that this is what? A compilation of later sources and presenting this as the work of Ibn Ishaq which has been preserved in those late sources. Right. So now we realize the same author or translator actually says Ibn Ishaq isn't the first author of the Sirah. He has other people writing it. I was going to show it from this book, but they're so afraid for you to know. So for example, we know the companions, many of the companions, Abdullah ibn Abbas, who died 78 Hijrah, he had books on Sirah. Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, Ara bin Azir, Sahal bin Hafma. Now this book is preserved in the later works in Baladri, in Ibn Sa'd, in Tabari and Waqidi. So we have earlier books than Ibn Ishaq, number one. But is it the only one? No. We have even the Tabi'un. You know what Tabi'uns are? Tabi'in, the students of the companions of the Prophet. So they heard these messages and narrations and events from the companions of the Prophet. Who are they? Aban bin Uthman bin Affan, who died 105 after Hijrah. This is preserved. His Sirah is preserved in the Muwatta of Malik, in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, in Tarikh al-Tabari, in Tarikh Yaqubi. We have also Urwa bin al-Zubair bin al-Awwam, died 94 Hijrah. It is also been published by Mustafa al-Azmi. So we now have Sirah works. You said, give me anything earlier than Ibn Ishaq, I have given you enough. So you are talking about something that makes no sense, only since it makes you're ignorant of those words.
Okay, in 5 minutes, here we go. Have you noticed everything that he has just said to you? All those names, are they extant today? Are any of their writings in existence today? Do we have the Muwatta? Who do we have who talks about the Muwatta? Who do we have who talks about Ibn As? Who is it that quotes them? Ibn Ishaq, Al-Tabiri, Al-Waqidi. Look and see the names, the ones that wrote it down. When did Al-Waqidi die? 835. When did Ibn Ishaq die? 833. When did Al-Tabiri die? 923. How many years after Muhammad do all these men die? 200 to 300 years later. If these did come from these men, why were they not preserved? Why is it we don't have Ibn Abbas and his original writings? And why even Al-Waqidi? We only have the Maghazi documents, the earliest of the Sirah documents. We don't have anything earlier than that. Folks, can you see the problem? Everything they're dependent on is what the 9th and 10th century people assumed the others had written. Now remember, Even Ibn Ishaq tells us that Ibn Ishaq, who died in 765, was the first to compile all these down. He didn't trust an awful lot of what Ibn Ishaq said. He didn't even know. He didn't get it from Ibn Ishaq. He got it from one of his students. And he threw out most of it and only retained a little bit. Al-Bukhari was given 600,000 of these writings that he's referring to in 850 to 870. And those intervening 20 years, he threw out 98% of it and only retained 2% of it. 7,397 out of 600,000. So why did he throw away 98% of it?
Some were weak.
Because he believed they were fraudulent. They were weak. They were not at all authoritative. How does he know any of it was authoritative? Did he live when the Prophet Muhammad lived? Did he hear the Prophet Muhammad speak? Did he even know the Prophet Muhammad? Did he come from the same century? No.
He had a dream of the
What about the century after? No. He comes from the 9th century. 240 years later. Everything they are dependent on what Ibn Abbas said, or any of the companions said, is only what Al-Bukhari, or Ibn Ishaq, or Al-Waqidi, or Al-Tabari decided what was authoritative. Now here's the question. If these men had written them as early as you're saying, why didn't they preserve them? Could they not read or write? Remember, according to your traditions, Islam controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo by 642. That's 10 years after your prophet's death. These are literate cities. These are sophisticated cities. You have controlled those cities, except for Jerusalem, even till today. For 1,400 years, you've controlled those cities. Why could you not preserve what the prophet did and what the prophet said? Why is it that suddenly they all get lost within 200 years and nothing is preserved until Ibn Hisham writes it down, Al-Waqidi writes it down, Al-Bukhari writes it down in 870, Al-Tabari writes it down in 923. That's the question we're asking, because we know Jesus did live. We know that there were biographies written about him. We know that those who wrote down what Jesus did and what he said actually knew Jesus. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses to what they wrote. Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. So which are you going to trust? The eyewitness account, 30 to 40, at the most 60 years after Jesus, written by those who knew Jesus, or Muhammad, 200 to 300 years after Muhammad. None of them knew Muhammad. None of them were living at that time. Who are you going to go with? What's his name? Jesus! That's why it's so important that you ask these historical questions. It's the late dates that we're having a problem with. Now we're going to go look and see what happened in the 7th century to see if these guys got it correct.
Enlightened waffle. You see, ignorance is not a bliss. Remember, I came into the way. What point? He was talking about, give me Sirah before Ibn Ishaq. This Ibn Ishaq that he's trying to tell us, he's actually later works. So he's happy with that. So I came along and did the same thing that he demands us of, which he uses. From preserved in later works, but actually started, they were written earlier. I gave many names, right? I gave many names which are even earlier than Ibn Ishaq. He somehow missed that altogether. So he doesn't even understand the response that is provided to him. It's very sad. But anyway, so the point is taken. Ibn Ishaq's Sirah is not the earliest. He wasn't the first one, neither was Ibn Hisham the first one to compile the Sirah. There was various others. How do we know them? Because their works are preserved in other extant later sources, just like Ibn Ishaq's. Excuse me.
No interrupting, Jay, please.
Just like Ibn Ishaq's works are preserved in other works, so is other writers' works preserved, and some of them I mentioned. I'm not going to repeat the point. Now he talked about Bukhari and so on. I'm not sure why he's talking about Bukhari. We have the teachers of Bukhari. Or Bukhari didn't just write it from his own memory. How did Bukhari write? He told us where he got his information from. He gets his information from his teacher, who gets his information from his teacher, all the way back to the Prophet. So we have a chain of transmission. What we have, which he knows, but he will not tell you, we have even other compilations earlier than Bukhari. Sahifa Hammam ibn Munabbi, an example of this document. And we can compare, and we see scholars have compared it. Professor Muhammad Hamidullah has written a book on this, comparing those things from the manuscripts. You can see it, but you want to be unaware of it. It's called selective ignorance. So we have earlier than Bukhari this material, and we can see how they have been preserved from Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu, the companion of the Prophet. Okay, now did Bukhari just throw out 98% of his works? No. This is another propaganda style lie from this gentleman. I'm sorry to say that. Bukhari was writing, as he says in his introduction, a mukhtasar, a small treatise, an abridgment of all that's there, but he's going to apply the strictest criteria to present this. He's also written other works in which he was lax from this criteria, like Adab al-Mufrad al-Bukhari. These are not all of them found in his Bukhari. And yet we found that he's actually using them. So this is Adab al-Mufrad. I'm sure you know this book, perhaps you haven't ever heard of this. So Bukhari, even himself, he compiled other books, which is not a strict criteria that he used in his Sahih. He didn't throw them out, he didn't say they're fraudulent. What an ignorant remark. He never said these are fraudulent, because these, in his criteria, doesn't come up to the standard of absolute Sahih. But they can be Hasan, which is still acceptable. Hasan is perfectly acceptable, and there are many hadiths like that. So he was not going about collecting all and throwing all away. No, this is a myth. Professor Mustafa Al-Azami, in his book, Studies in Early Hadith Literature, actually talking about all these things. You have seen it, you have read it, but you just laugh it away. I would like interested readers to go and read the sections from a muhaddis, a scholar of hadith, who explained this from the words of Bukhari. And if you don't want to do that, you want to go into Islamic Awareness website, you can do that. Now let's go back to the issues of trustworthiness of the books and documents. He is having difficulty in accepting other works that I mentioned, right? Some of the books I mentioned earlier than Ibn Ishaq, but he's happy to accept this book, which he's not happy to lend me, because see that Ibn Ishaq. He's happy to use that, but yet the same methodology when we use and we find earlier works, he doesn't want to use that. Now, I have never seen, in my experience, Christians are being consistent at all. So inconsistent. Talking about manuscripts and documentation. If this is going to create doubt in your faith, that how can I believe in it? It's so much removed, 200 years and so on. Let's talk about very quickly the Old Testament. The earliest manuscript of the Old Testament is what? From the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are 1,400 years away from when Moses, the prophet, peace be upon him, wrote. How long? The earliest extant available manuscripts of the Torah is 1,400 years old. I am sure Jay is going to be consistent and throw it away and say, I cannot trust it. I am doubtful. I'm skeptical that this is actually the Torah of Moses.
Okay, very good. You know, he hasn't answered the question I asked. Let me repeat it again, and so I want you to respond to this. If these were all written down in the 7th century, as you claim, where are they today? Show me one manuscript. Show me one sitta from the 7th century, from the companions, not only from the companions, but from the century that Muhammad lived. Show me why none of them exist today. And why is it you have to wait 240 years to finally get it written down, compiled? I'm sure they claim, and I'm sure they quote many of the companions. They say they come from those companions. But what was their criteria? You're not telling the people their criteria. It was the chain of names. Isnad, was it not? So-and-so got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the companion of the Prophet. What does that tell us? That is oral tradition. Therefore, everything that not only Hisham and Waqidi and Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, Tirmidhi, and also Tabari, all of them are based on oral tradition. The fact that you cannot show me any written documents shows me it's nothing more than what the 9th and 10th century people believe happened in the 7th century. And that's the problem I'm having. Because when you look and see who and what it talks about, when you look at the Quran, when you look at the geographical names, the geographic places in the Quran, take a look and see where these geographical places exist. 65 references to geographical places in the Quran. Over and over again. 24 times it talks about the people from Thamud. 23 times it refers to the people from Ad. 7 times it refers to the people from Midian. It mentions that this place where the prophet lived, notice, it only mentions the prophet name 4 times. But it refers over and over again to this messenger, this prophet, who lives in this place. It only mentions once where this place is. And it mentions in Surah 48, Ayah 24, that this is in Mecca. Isn't that interesting?
Mecca.
If it's such a important city, why is it only mentioned once in the Quran? But hold on a minute. It mentions that this city is in a valley with a parallel valley. It has trees, clay, loam. It has olive trees. It has a stream going through it. Folks, take a look at Mecca and see if that at all parallels what we now know exists in Mecca. Not at all. And also, if this prophet has so much contact with these people from Ad 23 times, the people from Thamud 24 times, the people from Midian 7 times. Look and see where these people live. They don't live near Mecca. They're 600 miles further north. 600 miles too far north. But what really is damaging, take a look and see what is up 600 miles further north. Look and see what fits almost every description we see in the Quran. What city does exist 600 miles further north that is surrounded by Thamud and Ad and Midian? What city is in a valley with a parallel valley with a stream going through it? What city does have plant growth? And what city does have olive trees? Petra is the only city that fits what we see in the Quran. What's even more interesting, take a look at all the mosques that are now being looked at, not the mosques today, but the mosques that are the ancient floor plans. Look at the ancient floor plans for the mosques that are in Jordan, the mosques that are in Syria, the mosques that are in Yemen, the mosques that are in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, even the Dome of the Rock, the whole citadel, as far away as Guangzhou in China. Look at where they're facing. Every one of them is facing Petra up until 725 AD. That's 100 years almost after Muhammad. Every mosque is facing Petra. Now, one of them is facing Mecca. Now, that should show you you've got a problem. See, that's why we're questioning your tradition. No wonder they're written so late. They've got the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time amongst the wrong people. Now, folks, I'm giving you historical material. And that's why we're asking this today. Show me how you can disconnect.
Very interesting again what we call this what theory. Oh, Mecca didn't exist. It wasn't in Mecca, you know what? Quraysh, specifically. Historians of the Kaaba, they were living in Petra. And there's a huge conspiracy. All the Muslims, every single one of them, the Muslim historians, the Muslim muhaddithin, the people who write hadith, the people who write biography, everyone somehow conspired all together to say Islam didn't begin in Petra, it began in Mecca. Now, he talked about all these references. Do you know where he gets this from? He gets this from some of his friends, like Dan Gibson. We'll talk about who Dan Gibson is, and his book, The Quranic Geography, in a minute. That's where he's coming from. I'm sure he hasn't even read it himself, and the evidence that is there presented within it. So now, let's come back. So let's talk about what the Quran talks about the geography. The Quran talks about As-Safa and Marwa. The Quran talks about Badr and Hunayn. Now, Jay would like to tell us, Safa, Marwa, Badr and Hunayn, as the Quran mentions them, actually they're in Petra. And his friend Tom Holland, he's actually seen those places in Petra. Or Dan Gibson, actually from space maybe, he's seen it in Petra, right? Hunayn, Badr, yes? Safa and Marwa, continuous living memory of the people. They don't associate the Badr is in China or in Petra. Badr is in Badr. Hunayn is in Hunayn. Safa and Marwa in Safa and Marwa in Mecca. So your quack theories doesn't count, my friend. Historical living testimony of the people. Of course you don't understand. So now, as we realize now, Quran doesn't only talk about this. In fact, what he didn't say is like this. Oh, the reason why we know it talks about Petra because there's a verse in the Quran which talks about the story of Lot. You pass them by morning and evening. What a mistranslation of these so-called dishonest evangelist scholars of yours. If you read this verse, it tells you, you pass them in the morning and also at night. This was the habit of the people at that time. When they're going to visit them, they either travel at morning, they'll travel at night. So it has nothing to do with their times of travel to mean, oh, because they pass by in the morning or pass by in nighttime, it means this area is in Petra. What a joke it is. It's a quack theory, nothing less than that. Now, coming back to this issue. You know, Qibla of the mosques. Does he even know the latitude and longitude of the mosques? Is he even aware that there's a Qibla wall or the mihrab niche? Can he even point? Okay, what scholarly work can you actually demonstrate? Not from a Tom, Dick and Harry book who's written a book. You know, anyone can write a book and publish. So now, which scholar have said that, oh, this particular mosque faces towards Petra? This particular mosque faces away towards the north to Jerusalem. You had Patricia Crona earlier on. He's changed his views. He doesn't like Patricia Crona anymore. Do you know why? Because Patricia Crona has changed a lot of her views. And he doesn't like that anymore. That's why he changed it to say, okay, oh, I want Dan Gibson. Excuse me. I want Dan Gibson. I like Dan. Because he's now talking about Petra, not Jerusalem anymore. We don't show the calculations, the historical references in our website, Islamic Awareness of Law, on the issues of Qibla orientation of early mosques. In Wasit, Kufa, Fustat, all of those in mosques in Cairo. Why? Showing how the earlier Muslims, before the first 200 years, they aligned their Qibla based on what? Is it the winter sunrise or summer sunset? Or is it to do the equinox? Or is it to do what? Is it just guesswork? Because the prophetic tradition says the Qibla is between east and the west. So Muslims use this as their reference point. And then they used the wall of the Kaaba, which is closely aligning to where it was. Right? Is it the winter sunrise or not? We have shown an article many years back for your reference. But he selectively ignores to understand the article, even though the references, all the evidence is there from David, King and others, quoting clearly the basis of Qibla determination. You come up with this quack theory by Dan Gibson, who says, oh, I have seen an aerial photograph. Do you even know the original floor plan? Do you even know where the wall is? Do you even know where the mihrab is? Which mosque? The mosques that were built and rebuilt again? How can you say this is the original floor plan? You're coming up with the floor plans, the mosques which are currently existing and say, oh, this is how it used to be. Not only that, I challenge you to show me in latitude and longitude every single mosque that you are quoting from Dan Gibson to say how many degrees away are they from Mecca.
I love this. It's obviously you've not read Dan Gibson's book. Otherwise you would know that. In fact, Dan Gibson confronted the Islamic awareness of this very notion. Look at page 235. Read it before you start making these accusations. Because Dan Gibson answers every one of these. He says, you guys are waffling when you talk about the southern solstice and the winter solstice. That means it's two different directions. But for heaven's sake, look and see where they're directed. And he's not looking at modern mosques. He purposely did not look at modern mosques. Because mosques have been destroyed and rebuilt many times. He's looking at the original floor plan. And it's not just Dan Gibson. Dr. Creswell, Dr. Fehabadi, are you going to interrupt me now so I can interrupt you? Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fehabadi noticed this back in 1905. This has been around for over 100 years. They noticed that the mosques were not facing Mecca. Now, they were erroneous. They thought it was Jerusalem. They were off by 3 degrees. They should have done their homework better. Thank God Dan Gibson did it for them. And that's why he has looked at everyone. And here's what's interesting. It's not that some were facing this way and some were facing that way to follow a solstice, a summer and a winter solstice. They were all uniformly facing Petra up until 725, including as far away as in Guangzhou in China. That's what's damaging. And then after 725, between 725 and 822, 50% of them finally start facing Mecca. 17% still are facing Petra. So there's a confusion, especially in North Africa. None of them in North Africa are facing either Petra or Mecca. It's not till 822 that every mosque then faces Mecca. Muhammad died in 632. Look at your map. It takes them 200 years to finally get it right. And that's why we're asking this question. But you still haven't answered the question I asked before. Why is it, if this man Muhammad is so important, if he's the greatest of all men, greatest of all prophets, the seal of all the prophets, the man that brought the final revelation, why did no one write down his biography in the century where he lived and preserve it till today? Why is it that no one wrote his sayings down in the century where he lived or the century after he lived? Why is it you cannot preserve something as important as that when we can preserve 4 testimonies of Jesus Christ from the 1st century? Folks, that's why we're asking this question. You can no longer say that these men, it's not important that they didn't write it down in manuscripts that we can still see today. What I will suggest and what I'm saying is that when it was finally written down by Ibn Ishaq al-Waqidi, 200 years after the fact, by al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, 240 years after the fact, by al-Tabari, Tirmidhi, Ibn Dawud, and many others, 300 years after the fact, when they finally wrote down, they quoted all these men, none of which have any authenticity because none of them have any written documentation to support any of their claims. You cannot get away with that, Muslims. You cannot ask us to believe something that is only based on oral tradition. Look what happens to oral tradition. I tell her something, she tells him, he tells him. By the time it gets back to me, after 15 minutes, it's 2 different comments. Can you imagine 200 years of oral tradition, which nothing is written down? Why is it, therefore, that we do not trust al-Bukhari and the traditions, that we're going back to the 7th century, and what we're finding out about the 7th century does not fit what we see today, nor does it fit what the 9th and 10th century people say happened. That's why we're asking this question. But when you come to Jesus Christ, and you look and see what he did, you look and see what he said, almost everything the gospel writers said about Jesus has the right man in the right place, at the right time, doing the right things. So who is more trustworthy? What is his name? Oh, I love that name, folks. That's the historical question you should be answering. Why is it we can answer the historical question about Jesus, but you cannot do the same about Muhammad? I give it over to you.
Did you notice one thing? I talked about consistency. I raised I talked about specifically the Old Testament, that's discourse, the Torah of Moses, and I highlighted that the Christians and the Jewish people do not have a text which is preserved of the Old Testament, but they do have, which is 1,400 years later. So a gap of 1,400 years. He's so happy to accept that. He's so happy to accept that this is okay. Even though it's 1,400 years, I believe in it. And I accept it. But according to his own accounts, let's say now, for the sake of argument, it's a mistaken argument, all the Quran on the Hadith is 200 years later. So compared to the Old Testament Torah, 1400 years and 300 years. He cannot accept anything 300 years, but he can accept 1400 years gap. But very consistent, isn't it? I'm sure this is a very scientific methodology he's using. Yeah? He will not answer that question. Because he knows that he trusts the Torah. That yes, this is still trustworthy, even though it has been transmitted for this 1,400 years by oral transmission. But what transmission? If you haven't got anything written, how was it transmitted? Okay, so it wasn't transmitted by anything then. Suddenly, you have nothing, and you have 1,400 year gap. And then you believe in acceptability. According to your historical criteria of acceptability, it's okay. It's perfectly acceptable. But when it's Quran, Hadith, 200, 300 or 100 years, it is not acceptable. What he misses again and again, what he actually deceives you, the historical biography of the Prophet, it wasn't first written by Ibn Ishaq. He keeps on trying to brainwash with that. Oh, Ibn Ishaq first compiled it. No! Before him, many compilers were there who put it. The thing that he needs to highlight is this. We have some of those documents preserved, Ibn Ishaq is one of them. In fact, it's not only Ibn Hisham, some of Ibn Ishaq's manuscripts are preserved, which Ibn Hisham used. And we have other biography writers which are preserved in later works. So again and again he keeps on what? Offering this conspiracy theory. The biography was not written. Of course it was written. He asked me, why is it preserved? There's many things that were told in Islamic history why they were not preserved. Because they were accumulated into later works. Muslim libraries at different times were destroyed by so many invaders. The whole of rivers were black because of ink from those books. So you're saying, oh, it's not preserved? Yes, the books were there. Some of the books are surfacing. For example, Sahih that I mentioned earlier, which predates Bukhari, which he doesn't want to even accept because he knows his whole theory is going to fall apart. This is now found, it's discovered, it's published, it's edited, but I don't like it anymore. So this whole issue of documentation and hearsay and all these things, you cannot be selectively ignorant or selectively understanding all these things. You have to understand that. So let's talk about the Torah. How do we accept the Torah is genuine? How do we know the Torah was written and it's not been corrupted by people? That it is still giving us information about salvation, about because when you read the prophecy, Jesus, where do you go to? You go to the Old Testament, which is what? All hearsay, because you have no extant documents. Thank you very much. So it's all based on hearsay. Faith is now based on hearsay. You talk about the New Testament writers. Do you know why they are not reliable? Because, for example, say Matthew, to give you out of many examples because of time, he says, oh, these are the generations from Abraham, David, from the exile to Babylon, and then to Jesus. 14, these are all 14 generations. Guess what? When we go back to the Old Testament, we find that they are not the only generations, there are more than 14 generations. So he's giving us what? He's not giving you history, he's giving you a biased, twisted, distorted history. He takes out one name from that person, later. He takes away Jehoiakim, because Jehoiakim is cursed. That his descendants will not have anyone to sit on the throne of David. So he takes him away. He invents prophecies, says, oh, he shall be called a Nazarene, but there is no such prophecy. So there's no reason why you would believe in such a person.
Real quickly, he's got that wrong. Look at Matthew 1, Jehoiakim is there. He is not taken away. Jehoiakim is part of that line. And that's why Luke writes another completely different genealogy. But Matthew's genealogy is David through Solomon, through Jehoiakim, who is the curse line, to Joseph. Whereas in the Lucan account in Luke 3, it is David through Nathan, the brother of Solomon, down to Eli, who they thought was Joseph, but everybody that knew who was reading it, this is the father of Mary. Now, let's go back. he is having a problem with the Old Testament. But he still hasn't answered my question. Why is it, if he's such an important man, nothing was written down, and why could it not be preserved? See, remember, everything that Moses wrote was on papyrus. How long does papyrus last? About 100 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls are unique because they were housed in jars in a dry place for 2,000 years. All of the New Testament was written on papyrus. Was the Quran and were these traditions by your companions written on papyrus? The answer is no. They didn't need papyrus in the 7th century. By that time, they had vellum and they had parchment. They had vellum and parchment in the 1st century. But only rich people could write on that because it was very expensive. It's only till the 4th century that vellum and parchment were used for the biblical manuscript. That's why we have the Sinaiticus written on vellum right here in the British Library from the 4th century, 300 years before the Quran. And that's why there's a proliferation of New Testament codices from the 4th century on. The Quran is a codex written on parchment. Where are all these traditions? There were no need to write a papyrus. So why did they not preserve them? That's the question we're asking. And why is it that when they finally do appear with Ibn Ishaq, with Ibn Hisham, 200 to 300 years later, that is when we start to get what they thought happened to Muhammad. But folks, we're not here to go tit for tat. What we're asking is a good historical question. Evidently, it was more important for the New Testament writers to write down what they knew, what they saw, and to translate it immediately. That's why we have not just 1 or 2 manuscripts, we have up to 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament alone, which is basically much like your Sirah and your Hadith, are they not? That's what the Gospel accounts would be. It's fascinating that we've got 10,000 Latin Vulgates, we've got 5,400 Greek manuscripts, we've got 9,000 in other languages. That makes 24,000. Where are these manuscripts, these codices for the Quran or also for the traditions? By the 6th century, we can now tabulate 230 of the New Testament manuscripts, either partial or complete. Certainly, the Muslims can come up with 1 manuscript of the Sirah, 1 manuscript of the Hadith that you talk about, from the time period that these men who are supposedly authoring these books, what happened to them? Were they thrown away? Were they lost? He says they were lost. They were destroyed. That's rather clunky, isn't it? How could you destroy and lose something that important? And for 200 years not reproduce it? Why does it take 200 years to finally retabulate it again? It's rather clumsy of you Muslims. Thank goodness we don't have that problem with the New Testament. He asks, why is it that we don't have the Old Testament? Folks, we don't need the Old Testament to know that it's authoritative. Just look and see how much of the gospel of the books of Moses, how much they touch history, and how that we have seen there's not one properly understood biblical statement that's controverted by 1 piece of historical evidence. That's why we do go back and we do trust the Torah. We don't have the original. You would expect it if they're written on papyrus 3,400 years ago. But we do know that even though they were written originally 3,400 years ago, they still have the right men doing the right things in the right place at the right time. And that's why I love my Bible. Both the old and the new. Now show me any other piece of literature that can make the claim we have just made about the Bible. And I put it back in your lap. Tell me now again why you lost those manuscripts.
Did you realize the answer he gave about the Torah? Even though he accepts there's 1,400 year gap, there's no manuscript. He's still accepting it. Which historical criteria and historical method is using to accept? Because remember, he's asking a historical question, not a faith question. Now he's shifting the goal. Remember, consistency is lacking within the Christian evangelism. So if he's asking a historical question, he should use a historical method. Which historical method is he now using to accept the Torah, which is not available for 1,400 years? It's called faith. Now I wonder which school that he's been schooled in history to learn about historical method. So now, as you realize, because the New Testament is sufficing him, because it says so the Torah is accepted. That is nothing to do with the historical method or answering a historical question. You are answering your own faith question. You believe by faith without any evidence for history. So the point is quite obvious. You need to be consistent. Christians need to learn how to be consistent. When we talk about the difference, 200 years, 100 years, to 1,000 years, come on guys, be consistent in your method. Unfortunately, we cannot teach you how to be consistent. You have to learn it from your own heart, from your own mind, from your own intellect. So now let's come back. When we talk about the manuscripts of we keep on talking about, oh, they were not written down. They were written down. He kept missing the whole point. They were written down. So you cannot ask him, oh, why did you not write down? Of course they are written down. Whether they're extant is a different question. Just like the Torah. You are happy to accept the Torah, even though you don't have anything written down for 1,400 years. When I asked you about the reason why we can trust or not trust the gospel writers, I gave two examples from Matthew. Matthew makes up history as he goes along. In the first page of his gospel, in the English translation, he talks about, okay, Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brothers. Not Jehoiakim, Jeconiah. Jeconiah was a grandson. Jeconiah is not the same name. If you go back to 1 Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 16, you will realize it's not the same name. Your scholars will tell you, Josiah had children. One of them was Jehoiakim. The children of Jehoiakim was Jeconiah and the brothers. So don't just change history, my friend. History is already documented in the Old Testament. So that question about Matthew's dishonesty and distorting of the Old Testament by saying what? These are all 14 and 14 generations, which is totally ahistorical, which is untrue. He talks about, oh, as was prophesied by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. I'm paraphrasing. There is no such prophecy. He can spend all his life, like he's spending all his career now to get a PhD for the last what? How many years? 20 years? Maybe more? Doesn't matter. Almost done. Yeah, no, that's fine. Very patient with the PhD, taking over 20 years. That's fine. You're a very patient man. Right, anyway, take this amount of time and you realize that what? If you actually study the Matthew's Gospels, he talks about this prophecy which is totally non-existent. You cannot find in any of the writings of the prophets, ever. Your scholars admit that. They admit it and you selectively ignore those admissions. It's not even there. He makes up many things. So how can you trust a person? You don't even know his second name. You don't even know whether he was truthful or not. You don't even know whether he was a lying person or not, whether he had a good memory or not. How can we accept a document? How can we accept a document? We have no testimony from the other people whether he was honest, truthful, having a good memory or not.
Okay.
Guess what? Guess what? Guess what? He's the only person who talks about dinosaurs. Actually, yes, I'll tell you why. He's the only person who talks about graves opening up. Bodies of saints coming up the graves and appearing to many people. If such an event happened here today, do you think only Jay will write it and everyone else will just keep quiet? It's like saying a dinosaur popping up in speakers going on this field. No one mentions this. No reporter mentions this in this paper, in the TV. Only person mentions about this Tyrannosaurus Rex is Jay Smith. No wonder you cannot trust Matthew, because he's making up all these fantastical things, nothing to do with history and reality. So how can we trust such a gospel and say, oh, this is going to give my salvation? I'm sorry, you need to come back to Quran.
Really good, folks. Did you hear that? We don't know. We can't trust Matthew because he doesn't have a second name. Why don't you read and see who Matthew is? He's the brother of James. Both of them are the son of Alphaeus. Ibn Alphaeus. What is Muhammad's second name? Bingo, you've got a problem. But I don't ask asked you that. I don't ask for his authority because he doesn't have a family name. But facts is, here's the problem. Where is Muhammad even referred to? Where is there the first reference to any documentation that mentions Muhammad by name? Show me anything before 692. Show me anything that's extant today that refers to him within Muslim sources that still extant today. We do know about Muhammad from ex-Muslim sources, the Doctrine of Iacobi, the writings of Sabaeus. We know he's historical, but why is it that we don't hear anything until the time of Abdul Malik about this man? We don't have any reference to people called Muslims or people or a religion called Islam until 692. Why is it we have no reference to a city called Mecca until 741? Muhammad died in 632. Why is it there's no documentation of any city called Mecca for almost 100 years after the death of Muhammad? You're shaking your head because you haven't done the work on this. And the first map that finally shows the city of Mecca is not till 900 AD. Muhammad died in 632. You do your own math. That's 270 years later that they finally get down the first map that shows a city called Mecca. Without Mecca, what are you going to do with Muhammad? Without Muhammad, what happens to Islam? But can you see why we're asking these questions? So he doesn't like the Old Testament. I would love to take you to the British Museum. Thank God for you British. You stole everything and brought it back to one building so we can look at it. Just look at what they have in the British Museum to support the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, in fact, look at the book of Jeremiah and Daniel and even the book of Genesis. We can now support who Abraham was. We know that almost every one of the customs that are found in the Genesis account about Abraham are now supported by the Nuzi documents, the Nuzi tablets, and the Mari tablets. How about the Ebla tablets that were just discovered in the last century? We now know that there's a city called Sodom and Gomorrah because of the Ebla tablets. See, we don't need the documents. What Moses wrote in 1400 BC has been trying to be discredited year after year, and yet we keep on coming up with newer documents, newer tablets that are being discovered, not only for Sodom and Gomorrah, but look at the trade route that they talk about. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zebub, and Zoar. Those now proved to have been eradicated in 1900 BC. Well, who do you think eradicated them? What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah in 1900 BC? The Ebla tablets were written in 2300 BC, 400 years earlier, proving that the Bible gets it correct, even gets the trade route correct. That's how specific and how accurate our Old Testament is. We don't ask it to be that accurate. It just happens to be. So we don't need the documents for one very simple reason. The documents would have all disintegrated long before 1400 years. What's fascinating is that even without the documents, we show the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time. Now, why cannot you do the same with Muhammad? That's what we've asked about. You keep on dismissing that we don't need the documents about Muhammad. Folks, we're not talking about papyrus anymore. We're talking about a time of history where there were no libraries that existed in Alexandria in the 5th century. Look at Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. These were sophisticated cities. Why could they not preserve these biographies of this prophet man named Muhammad? And why is it that his name is not on any document prior to 691 from within Arab sources? You notice I'm not saying Muslim sources, because even the Arabs don't call them Muslim themselves. They call themselves Saracens. They call themselves Maghrebs. They call themselves Hagaris. They call themselves Ishmaelites. They call themselves Mahajuruns. Notice Muslim is not in those 5 phrases that they refer to themselves. This is why we're asking the question. Come on back to Jesus. He makes a lot more sense. He's a lot more historical.
It's important to understand the substance he's talking about. Remember, the key questions I'm asking is this. What historical method are you using to accept the Torah? It is not a faith question. And you've heard the answer. The answer is, oh, other artifacts. Because it's accurate, we can accept that. Other artifacts proves that this is a historical method. The Torah, which we have none of it for the 1,400 years of history of this transmission, is acceptable. Now, very interesting historical method. I'm sure you're going to teach this historical method in your classes to your students and so on, right? You only get I'm not going to say what the students will get when they go to real academics. But anyway, so now let's come back to this point. We are talking about what? Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is he mentioned? Do you know why he's selectively zooming in to Arab sources? Because he's aware. Scholars have written already, that's right, this is for you. Scholars have already written books with documentary evidence that even the name Prophet Muhammad is mentioned. Guess what? How many years after Prophet Muhammad's death? 1.5 years. Within 2 years of the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his name is mentioned. Mentioned where? The Thomas the Presbyter, writing in 640 CE, 19 after Hijrah. He knows that already. But why is he Why is he selectively being ignorant? What are these people saying? What are these other non-Muslims saying? They're talking about the Arabs. They're talking about Prophet Muhammad of the Arabs and so on. And Muhammad that didn't exist, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So they're talking about a Muhammad which they're so concerned of, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that didn't exist and they're writing about it. So you need to be consistent. We have testimonies of what? These non-Muslim sources which talks about Prophet Muhammad within 1.5 years after his death. I rest my case. I don't have to even talk about anything else. Returning back to the New Testament writers.
Does he accept that? Okay. Yes, of course. I've already said so.
No. Returning back to Matthew. Remember, you see, when we have a discussion, the only answer you would answer is the one you know, right? The one you're comfortable with. Oh, what's his second name? Matthew ibn X, Y, and Z. But my key point wasn't about what his second name is. Whether he was a truthful person and never lied. Point number one. Whether he had a good memory, because if he's writing it down, come on, we are going to give you very fine criteria, because it is not just accepting a historical work. This is supposed to be a work for your life and death in hellfire or in heaven. A book that is going to determine your life in hereafter. Am I going to just take any person writing without knowing whether he always spoke the truth or not? If he lied in writing, and then you would realize that he's deceived you in his life. If he had a bad memory, then he would have written something which is totally incorrect as well, because he forgot it. Like you forgot that. When I talked about memory, and you didn't understand that I was talking about memory. Did you have a memory lapse? This is my key questions. Memory, truthworthiness, and trustworthiness. Truthfulness and trustworthiness. You have no way to demonstrate that, because you have nothing. Instead, what we find when we examine the books, I gave you 3 examples. Now let me return to this example again. Dinosaurs, right? Think about it. I want you to think, please, think. If a dinosaur now came up from the ground there, Tyrannosaurus Rex.
There's already one standing there.
Right. If a T-Rex came along, started roaring, and it walked along here, and then it went this way. Do you really think? None here who's standing. No one will record this event except J. Smith. If J. Smith was the only one writing about this, do you think this is a reliable account?
No.
Because such a huge event of magnitude would have been recorded by various other people, other gospel writers, or other historians at that time, because those saints that came up from the graves. What is more important, raising up one man from alive, if you believe, or many people from the dead to life? The significance is more people. They went and appeared to many. Now, those people who appeared to other people, did they just remain silent? What a conspiracy theory, isn't it? They remain in their conspiracy, totally silent. No wonder this is nothing to do with history, because such an event should be, as you expect, using your historical method, to be transmitted by multiples of people. There is no such thing. Answer that question.
We only have 50 minutes left, so I'm going to do summation now, okay? So we're going to do summation, and then you do summation.
Please run away, please.
I'll see you next week. I have to go 50 minutes, because I have people Did you notice what we've done today? Let's do a summation. The question we asked at the very beginning, we want to stick to the historical record. The historical record from Islam, as we have heard, Mansur has not been able to support it. He cannot support Mecca. He didn't even try to go down that route. He did not really support the Qibla. He tried to talk about the solstices. That's already been discredited by Dr. Dan Gibson. Remember, Dan Gibson has worked for 20 years on this. He's not some floozy you'd like to dismiss. More than that, he has grown up in fact, he lived there for 20 years doing this research. But more than that, he has not still given us any reason why this could not be preserved. Why is it that the New Testament record could be preserved? Why is it that it is preserved in 4 different testimonies? Why is it we don't have this problem of 200 to 300 years before it's finally written down? See, this is the question that we're asking. This is the historical problem that Islam has not dealt with. Secondly, we asked, if there is a historical question about the person of Jesus Christ, or about Moses that you brought up, you use, again, historical artifacts. You dismiss the artifacts and poo-poo them as if they're not relevant, without thinking through, folks. Every one of the artifacts we've looked at, I just gave you one example of the authority of Abraham. We now know also that the book of Daniel is correct, the book of Jeremiah is correct, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. We know that 1st and 2nd Samuel is correct. All of these are now been tabulated and corrected by artifacts from not only the periods that they existed, we're talking about the Assyrian period in the 9th and 8th century, from the Babylonian period from the 7th, 6th century, but also the Persian period from the 6th and 5th century. Hundreds of artifacts that now support almost every statement, showing that they've got the right man at the right place at the right time. We're not looking for the documents, we're looking for corroboration. And notice, I said Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian. None of these are Jewish. These are extra-biblical corroboration. That's the same question that we need to do of the Quran. He still assumes that everything we should listen to are from his traditions written in the 9th and 10th century. I don't trust the 9th and 10th century to tell us what was happening in the 7th century. So that's why we're going back to extra Quranic material, extra Islamic material, and what we're finding from the 7th century does not parallel the 9th and 10th century tradition. Can you see why we're doing like with like? Until Muslims can show us manuscripts of this Prophet Muhammad from the people that knew him, the eyewitness account, that have been preserved till today, we will doubt anything they say about their prophet. Until they can show us sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that come from the same century that he lived, that are still extant today, then we will not trust them. But folks, we can do that with Jesus Christ. That's the beauty of Jesus Christ. We're asking the same thing that we provide of Jesus Christ, we're asking the same thing for Muslims to provide for Muhammad. We're asking the same thing of any scripture, not just the Bible and the Quran, or not just the Sirah or the Hadith of Jesus, but also of any tradition that claims to have a historical statement. If it's the Bhagavad Gita, or the Upanishad, or the Vedas, we'd ask the same of them. The Book of Mormon, all of them must pass this historical test. Now, Christianity has had this thrown at it for 200 years. We've passed every one of these tests. That's why I love talking about Jesus here, because we've got the right man, doing the right thing, in the right place, at the right time. What a Jesus we've got. Prove the same for Muhammad, and maybe we'll listen to you. But until you can, don't keep saying they were destroyed or they were lost. And it's not important that none of these documents were preserved. They had to be preserved because you control the area. And you've controlled those cities and those regions for 1,400 years. Please don't tell me that they could not have been preserved. When we can preserve our New Testament all the way back from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, the entire New Testament 300 years before the Quran even came into existence. Folks, otherwise we're not going to believe it. Listen, if you want the historical text, come to the New Testament. You want the man of history, come back to Jesus. You want God of history, come back to the Bible. I give you Jesus, I give you the Bible. God bless you. We'll see you next week.
God bless you. Come back to Jesus. God bless you. Right, to summarize. All right. So I asked a historical question. Very important historical question. How do we trust these narratives that are reported in those Gospels that he believes in? I chose, as a Muslim, I chose the Gospel of Matthew. And I showed that Matthew makes up history, distorts history, and he gives you all these fantastical events which has no relevance in reality. So I asked him to have an answer. Give an answer.
The Muslim is no different from the Christian.
Excuse me, we're having a debate.
They are all the same thing. They are all the same thing.
So we are asking, no, don't be unfair. 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
You guys continue.
No, don't be rude. 5 minutes I listen to you, you give me the same respect. Same respect. So now let's continue. So, excuse me.
I said I had only about 5 minutes to go.
Don't be rude.
You continue filming it.
Don't be rude. Don't be rude. I listened to you for 5 minutes.
You did actually say that. I put it on video.
Right. So now, as we talked about, historical question, we asked a historical question about Matthew. We showed you why he cannot be trusted. The example of dinosaur I gave so I can understand. He didn't even bother touching it. You know why? Because your own scholars have been problems with this narration. Why Matthew makes up all these fantastic events. So, do you have any reasonable ground to actually even accept or rely on those Gospels? We have none. Excuse me.
Answer the question.
Excuse me.
Jay, you're interrupting.
Answer the question that I've been asking.
But you said summation. This is a summation.
He's hitting at one point. Give the answer of the whole debate.
I'm summarizing.
This goes on YouTube.
So the summary is this. So the summary I made was my critical question of history, historical question. You failed to answer it. You didn't even
failed
bother.
Mecca, you failed the
Excuse me.
Qibla, you failed the manuscript.
Why
Come on, answer the question.
Jay, you're
You had
actually
your 5
wasting your
minutes.
time now.
You had your 5 minutes.
That's a
Wasn't
little
it
bit
enough?
naughty. That is a little bit naughty.
Sorry.
Shall I tell you why?
Keep to the issue, guys.
Jay,
I
because
wanna hear
you
the
were the
answer
one,
for this.
Jay, you were the one that actually said that we kept interrupting. At no point has this gentleman interrupted you. Now you ready to go home is actually, let me just zoom out because I want to get this on film as well. Are the one who is actually interrupting.
Answer the questions we've asked at the very beginning.
So why don't you let him sum up and he has the respect for you?
Brother, later.
Bro.
Excuse me, brother. How much do you get paid?
Bro.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bro.
It's on the internet.
Akhi, one second.
50,000.
Bro,
Anyways,
don't worry about it.
You
You know it's bro, 1 second.
Why you're going away to so rude?
Give me, why is it you don't have Muhammad material?
Are you going to let me
Why is
summarize
it you
my
wait
own
200 years?
Excuse me.
Why is it you don't have any reference
Why
to
is he having
Mecca?
another chance to speak?
Why is it you don't have a transcript of the Qibla?
Now,
Help me with these.
Listen.
Sorry, bro.
When you
I
spoke,
want to get all this in.
I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say, oh, answer the question about Matthew. Answer the question about Matthew. I didn't ask you that. I let you speak the way you want
I
to
have
speak.
been asking this now for a half an hour. Actually for an hour.
So now it's my chance to speak and summarize in 5 minutes, which I'll start from now again. So, as I said, as Muslims, we would like to invite you to understand. Come back to who? Come back to a particular prophet? No. Come back to the God of all the prophets. Worship the God of Jesus Christ. Worship the God of Moses. Worship him alone. Because he has no partner. He did not have a son or a daughter. So worship him alone and come back to Islam, which was the pure and sincere submission to God. So I invite you, now coming back to the subject that Hannah was discussing after this invitation. So I asked a historical question just to show you how, even though you have a document within the first 100 years or 200 years, still when examining the document, how do we accept them? They're actually giving us true information. I talked about Matthew and the examples of his saints coming up from the graves. Brother, instead of answering with a historical answer, giving a historical, reliable answer, you tried, you didn't even try it, right? You didn't even bother trying it. So now, let's go back again. Your historical method of accepting the Torah, even though there's no documents, is by looking at the artifacts. When it comes to Islam, you are hyper-skeptical. Who do you go to? You go to Patricia Crona, you go to Michael Cook, you go to Dan Gibson now, because you don't like those people anymore. Excuse me, do not interrupt. Do not interrupt. It's my turn to speak. Don't be so rude. You know, I know you're consistently rude, so in this debut, in this video now, as you'll realize, when speaker to speaker, you'll realize who interrupts who. when this goes up in the YouTube, you'll realize. So you need to be consistently following a method so we can have a discussion. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak without any interruption again. So now let's return to the subject. When we are talking about a book that we're going to believe in, the book must present history correctly. So we know Matthew doesn't present history correctly. So on what reasonable grounds can a sane person trust this book of Matthew? I haven't gone to Luke yet, or to other Gospels. I only started with the first very page of the New Testament. Only open the first page and you have 3 problems. So you need to really understand, when we examine the books, your books falls apart to historical scrutiny. Not this historical method that you want to use. We have 24,000 manuscripts. Okay, if I give you 250,000 manuscripts, which is 250,000, so that means we have a better truth? What kind of reasoning is this? Because we have 250,000 manuscripts of the Quran. So now we're in a better position according to your own logic. I'm sorry.
You want me to answer that?
No, you're not answering anything. It's my information. So I'm surprised with your inconsistent method. Again, Christians, please become consistent in your methodology, in your discussion with Muslims. So when we have all these manuscripts, you never talked about the manuscripts, how they are different. British Museum, you talked about. I have been there, my friend. I've been to British Museum, and guess what? They opened up Codex Sinaiticus in what page? A page about the story of the adulteress, which is missing in the Codex Sinaiticus, and it's present in your Bible. So your Bible has a story which was later interpolated, forged. So you're talking about evidence, material evidence. British Museum, you need to tell them, beg them to take this page away and display something else, because they are showing you how your Bible has been corrupted. So how can you trust a book that is corrupted, that talks about history that cannot be trusted on? When it comes into the Quran was transmitted by what? Only in writing? No. The Quran was transmitted also by memory and memorization. What he doesn't want you to understand is this. You go to mosques in Ramadan in 1 month, and you see how the Quran is all recited from the heart, without mistakes. If there are any one single mistakes or even a letter, they will be corrected by many. All over the world. This practice happens today, year before, the decades before, all the way back to the Prophet. There is no way Quran can be changed. It's been preserved, and look at the message of the Quran. Come back to the Quran and come back to Islam.
We're going to do this later. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a next debate. Keep it on. Let me answer this.
We don't need
You don't want the answers for these. Now you're running away. You want answers for these? Okay, listen. In 2 weeks, we'll continue this, okay? We'll do the Quran.
You had your Jay.
We'll destroy the Quran for you.
Just say this.
We're going to destroy
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to point something out. Jay was in a hurry to run away when Mansur had his sum up time. Now he wants to answer the question. This is called hypocrisy or lying. One of the two.
Jamal, see, you want the last say. We will do this again in 2 weeks.
If we're still
and
lying.
we will destroy what he just said in the last 5 minutes.
You will, because you won't
bless
be
you.
here.
God bless you. This is
Wait,
going up on YouTube.
bro, I need to speak to you.
next
You
one
notice
will be-
what Jay actually said. He goes, I don't get paid for this. He meant I don't get paid to turn up to Hyde Park. But you're right, it is a 50 grand salary that he's on.
50
Because he's
grand?
paid
Where
like
do I get 50 grand from? I would love to get 50 grand. Bring it to me.
I'll tell you what, we'll do some bank together, we'll have a look.
It's worth 50
Who do you
grand.
bank with? Who do you bank with?
I have lawyers.
Let's go to Lloyd's.
Come back next week. I'll prove it to you. Yeah?
Prove what to me?
I'll prove it to you.
Who are you?
I get 50,000. I'm a nobody, but I'm going to prove to you.
It's 50,000.
You just lied to yourself.
I don't get 50,000. Wouldn't I love to get 50,000? God bless you. If you can give it to me, I'd take it. But for the kingdom of God. Thank goodness I don't have to answer that. Listen, I've got some people here. I suppose I've got my Thank you guys. I don't even know who you are. I know.
If I win, I don't want